All right, welcome everybody to the SIG Cloud Provider meeting. I'm Chris Hodge, one of the co-leads from the OpenStack Foundation. And it looks like Andrew and Jago are also here. I guess we'll get the meeting started with the usual introductions. Is there anybody who is attending this meeting for the first time who would like to introduce themselves?
Hi, I'm Aaron Krickenberger. This is my first time at this meeting.
Welcome, Aaron.
Which cloud provider are you working with, Aaron?
Cloudbeard.
Cloudbeard.
Of SIGbeard.
Yeah, you should see the cluster API provider for this. It's crazy. Yeah, no, I guess I'm here bringing my SIG testing experience to the table for whatever that's worth.
Thank you.
We love testing. Okay, so I just dropped the agenda into the chat in case people didn't have that, and so you can take a look at it. Our first topic is going to be led by Jago, which is about provider binary discovery and validation. We've actually allocated a pretty good chunk of time for this, a good 20 minutes so that we can talk about this, because it's a pretty important topic of, now that we have this external provider, how are we going to make it possible for users to discover the proper binaries to drop into their clouds. So Jago, take it away.
Sure. So this is a pretty broad topic and is relevant to, but not completely owned by SIG Cloud Provider. So mostly I just wanted to raise awareness and start a discussion here as to whether we have requirements and or a proposal or direction that we would like to see this go. And what I mean by this is maybe a good place to start is the KubeCon of last year in December. Tim Hawken and Michael Rubin gave a talk about Kubernetes as a kernel versus as a distribution, the open source project itself. And I think the core of that question is really what this conversation is about, and what does the Kubernetes build and release process produce? Does it produce an artifact which can be combined with other things by vendors or independent entities to create a useful collection of things? Or does the Kubernetes build and release process itself produce executable code that's useful on its own? And so when I say it's not just about cloud provider, what I mean is Kubernetes, the project, is being broken down into more and smaller components that are often independently versioned and maintained. So examples of that are ingress or core DNS. And sometimes these things are required. So DNS, you must have DNS. I expect if we don't already, we will have required but mutually exclusive components that may be part of your Kubernetes installation. And so while I think kubedns and core DNS could actually coexist, that might not be the case in some future version. And so I think this is a good forcing function for the discussion. We currently bundle together the initial 7 cloud providers just because they happen to be in tree. But this doesn't provide a consistent experience for users of external cloud providers. We did some work to articulate requirements for having a repository in the Kubernetes organization. So I hope we could reuse that for some discoverability of cloud provider code that's necessary. But I am hopeful that there can be a consistent directory structure or discovery mechanism that will hold not just for the cloud provider code, but also for DNS required extensions, some at least structure and maybe tooling to provide consistency for end users and a starting point where you get something useful. And so I wanted to raise this and see if others have been thinking about this as well, and see if this group has requirements for that broader conversation, and start with that.
Sure. So
I can go ahead, Andrew.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, like, to date, the way we've done discovery has been we have tools that install Kubernetes. Like we have KubeUp and we have Kops and we have KubeAnywhere and lots of others I'm sure I'm forgetting. And I think, so I've definitely seen this problem pretty heavily from the like maintainer of Kops type hat. And I think we currently don't even have in addition to discovery, we also don't even have a way for a project that is not in the main tar.gz file to be built and distributed in what I would consider great, trustworthy, repeatable, reliable way. And I think, Jago, what you mentioned about the process by which we approve repos, I would love for us to build a whole process around when you get a repo, you also get a GCS bucket or an S3 bucket or both. You get a CI build and a signer and the ability to push to a Docker repo. So the ability to distribute these things. And then we don't currently have a great distribution mechanism. A great discovery mechanism. I think Kops is working on that. I would like it for it not to be part of Kops. And as I'm sure you know, Jacob, I've been looking into that sort of space. But that's sort of where I see the current state of things in terms of where the ecosystem is today.
Okay, I think Andrew, you were going to jump in also.
Yeah, so I was just going to mention on my end. So from building DigitalOcean's Cloud Controller Manager, one of the issues that we ran into was, well, it's not really an issue, but like a future concern of mine is that we're hosting our CCM Docker image on Docker Hub. That was just kind of it's free and public, it just works. But like we have concerns around, Docker Hub in the future could be deprecated. Or like, for example, like not to say that Google's registry is not better or worse than Docker Hub's, but having a consolidated, like knowing that like all the cloud provider distributions and everything are all hosted on the same registry and all those things, like that's something that would be nice to have a standard for. Right now, everything, it's like where the Docker images come from is just, it's all free for all.
Right, we're hosting our Docker images on Docker Hub too, and the name of our repository is Kubernetes Cloud Provider, which feels both descriptive and non-descriptive in ways that are problematic.
Sure.
So speaking from the SIG testing perspective, like, holy crap, I would love to live in a world where we have a pre-baked release process that you can just stamp out for every single repo. Like I'm trying to do this today for having a pre-baked pull request review merge process for every repo. But we're not there today. Further, I've seen a lot of friction from individual projects who are like, no, we want to make our sausage our own way. So this is why the whole release process has kind of been left as an exercise to the reader. But I think sort of to Jaco's point, like I would rather we work from what is the spec and the discoverability thing and then work backwards. Like it'd be cool if everybody got a GCR.io repo and everybody pushed their images to the same place, but that's like an implicit form of discovery, not explicit. And I think we should really think about that. The other thing I wanted to add is I'm probably not super familiar with where Justin's work is today with Kops, but it sounds to me like we're talking about the context of add-on managers, and I'm trying to understand if we're talking about like things that go into the cluster like DNS that are required, or if we're talking about things that run alongside your cluster like Cloud Controller Manager that provide additional functionality. And then I would also think about things at that layer might also include things like CNI, CSI, CRI implementations. Am I blowing scope, Jago, or is that kind of...
No, and when I say that cloud provider is part of this whole domain, that's what I mean, is that it is both the dependencies of and the extensions of Kubernetes that make for what a user needs to install. And I think maybe it's a spectrum. Maybe like the beginning there's a structure or spec and interaction with kubeadm that can inspect and consume that spec and then is responsible for assembling the bits. Maybe we like start there, but at some level it's about versioning of those internal components and like the Kubernetes equivalent of a POM file from Maven, right? Like what version of all the things do I need? And I think there are corollaries in every project that has ever existed that isn't itself completely self-contained. So hopefully we don't end up reinventing everything. But really, I think the starting point is it the Kubernetes community goal to provide as output a useful artifact on its own, or is it the kernel that is consumed and extended and made useful by other entities? And I don't expect everyone to agree on that, but I think any effort or sub-project of SIG release that takes this work on needs to start from that moment, from yes, there is value in something that runs at least on Minikube or Docker and Docker or something that's an executable, useful thing on its own. And then if you want to take those bits and combine them with ever greater functionality and add lasers, you can do that, but you get something useful from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think that's a useful starting point to have, that yes, we should actually create something that is useful at the end of our exercise. And it's not just libraries that can be consumed by vendors to make things that are useful. Is that generally consensus on that point, or is there argument within this group on that point?
No, I think that's very useful, and for me, you know, in an ideal world, you know, part of the mandate of what the SIG cloud provider is a way to generate trust. So to set standards and generate trust amongst the community that the code that the individual providers are producing meets a certain standard. And it might be nice to have, you know, if we work towards a world where, you know, there were, you know, SIG cloud provider was able to give a stamp on individual providers at release time saying that, you know, the providers that they're being maintained, that they're being worked on, that they're trusted. And then that means that the Kubernetes community can create builds of those at release time and have them in like a GCR registry where you know that the trusted, you know, DigitalOcean provider is in the same place as the trusted IBM provider, you know, and that if you want those container images, you know that they've been built, you know, in a secure place, you know that they've been built by the community and not, you know, it's not just like go to Docker Hub and hope that you're not downloading a Bitcoin miner.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
Go ahead.
From my thinking as a member of SIG release, this is Caleb. I would say that at least my desire is something a bit even stronger than the position you've laid out, Jago. I do think there's a community responsibility to provide, and whether it's at the Kubernetes level or at the CNCF level, but a vendor neutral place to expose working combinations of the distributions. So, you know, for every release, we get questions about what version of Docker now, what versions of the CRI compliant runtime, what CNI versions work. You can imagine the same thing for storage plugins, for also cloud provider implementations or cluster API actuators now as well. I think, yeah, like you were suggesting, I think we do need a place where you have like a bill of materials for what is inside of your distribution. Whether I think the community has a responsibility to provide common tooling, and as a process, like as part of onboarding non-Googlers onto the release process, I think certainly we need multiple, it should be possible to build all the artifacts in multiple sites. So we are correlating the results of the release process from a couple of, you know, a handful of trusted locations. So not just Google, but also Amazon. I can imagine also the OpenStack Foundation providing some tooling and their shared CI resources that, you know, you have a reproducible build for the core part of the, you know, for the kernel. And that also validates the combination provided by the other distributions. And that's checked in someplace, so like an actual like receipt file for every release. So I think, yes, we have the responsibility of producing a minimally working thing, but also for the distributions, at least for the conformant ones, and possibly as a part of the conformance effort, specifying what all has been validated in those results. So what CNI plugin did you use? What CRI runtime?
Yeah, there was an effort by a team contracted by CNCF to demonstrate some of those components working together, the compatibility matrix of some sort, and there was a dashboard. I'll try and dig it up and add it to the notes if I can find it.
It was like an all-to-all thing, and like Hippie Hacker has another kind of related to that that I'll dig up and try to attach as well.
Okay, so I'm going to cut you off, Caleb, because Aaron's been patiently waiting with his hand raised for a while, and I want to give him a chance to speak up.
Sure. Yeah, that thing's a cross-cloud CI effort, and
right.
Okay, but I don't think it's necessarily like the full-on manifest. I think it's more verifying that Kubernetes can stand up on clouds. So, straw man, let's say there's a null cloud provider, and the release team is in charge of shepherding something out the door, and they do it with this null cloud provider. How do other people verify that they can produce a distribution using their cloud provider? And how does that impact the release schedule?
So that is the conformance effort, and I think where we've done a good job in this effort, and is to leverage the conformance tests and some of the work done by SIG testing to provide an incentive for cloud providers to run the conformance test themselves and post back to a centralized test grid dashboard. And so I think that is the responsibility of the providers or distributions who intend to be conformant. The value they get is that we raise awareness of incompatibility issues, or one user or one developer working on one cloud inadvertently breaks another. I think that's a distinct effort, and I think that's appropriate. What I would like to do is leverage that pattern where we provide incentive rather than a mandate. And so the kind of incentive I can see is that by following the format of this spec, we work together with the kubeadm folks and make sure that they and some similar tools can read that spec and produce the artifacts in a reliable and reproducible way. That's the incentive to conform to the spec of what is or is not in your distribution. We had both Justin and Aaron had thoughts.
I yield to Aaron. Go for the like follow-on question. It looks like go on.
Yeah, sorry. Just to follow on there, like the process today involves a lot of tests that are substantially more than conformance tests. So how would we get to the future where we depend solely upon conformance tests while not losing fidelity or confidence that the cloud providers that block the release today would continue to function well in the future?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. One is I don't believe the conformance tests are sufficient today to describe what a user expects from Kubernetes. So there's a gap to close there, and that's understood and working on that. The other part is I think there is a distinction between what is the base functionality of the API surface of the base, the mini distro, the whatever thing runs on Minikube, and the auto scaling nodes and things you would only expect to work in a public cloud provider, for example. But I want to go back to the sort of essence of this and what our group feels the output of the Kubernetes build and release process itself ought to be. And we have been joined by Tim Hawken, whose talk I referenced at the beginning. I think when someone pasted that in, his spidey sense went off and he wandered over here. But I think it ought to be in scope for the Kubernetes project to produce something that can run on a Raspberry Pi or Minikube or Docker and Docker and provide some base functionality just as a sanity check. And that we should strive towards some standard structure and format for pulling in the rest of the bits, such that someone who comes along and makes a new bit knows where to put it, how to get started, whether it's required to sign that bit or not, what the license requirements are and where it will live, to ease the on-ramp for that new bit to be included in multiple distributions of Kubernetes. So that's kind of the starting point, and I think it can be stronger than that to get to Caleb's point. But I want to make sure we start with the sort of first principles and move out from there and to figure out what's in scope and who else needs to be involved.
So,
yes, Tim has the floor.
I agree very strongly with that. And anybody who saw my talk knew that we called this out as a problem almost a year ago. We haven't really made progress on it. We've sort of taken a middle ground position to it. I'm not sure that that is going to be viable in the longer term. So, having the release produce a null cloud provider result, I think is an interesting result. It does bring up the issue of conformance tiers. We have facets of the Kubernetes API that are strictly optional, but if engaged, they do have some amount of conformance that we would want for them to apply. I'm thinking about things like load balancers and ingresses and those sorts of things, which would not be satisfied on a null cloud provider, whether that was D&D or Minikube or something else. So we have to sort of address that problem around conformance, but we have to do that anyway. So that's not really a problem. I'm sorry for being late. I couldn't find the room. What is the feeling of the group with respect to the idea that we might produce a release artifact that didn't have cloud providers in it?
Well, for some of the members of the group, there's no distinction from the current operating
Fair.
path. So DigitalOcean, for example, does not have an entry provider. And even more noteworthy to this discussion, our strategy is working in that OpenStack has deprecated its entry cloud provider and is working primarily on their out-of-tree cloud provider because it's just easier.
That's awesome news, and that's exactly what we expected.
Well, I was going to say, and I think what's more, the working group has had that as a goal. Sort of one of the ways in which we will know we're successful is when we can delete all cloud provider code from what I would call Kubernetes.
Yep.
Well, that's one part. That's the source code. What
No,
we're talking
agreed,
about now is the build and release process.
Right.
No,
You
agreed.
could-
But if I can delete it from Kubernetes and can run all of this, then presumably the kernel is now cloud provider agnostic.
Yes. But you can imagine a world where we say, look, the Kubernetes release.tar has always had support for these, whatever it is, 8 or 9 cloud providers. And so we will take those cloud provider modules and we'll bundle them into the upstream release so that upstream release continues to be useful on those 8 cloud providers. And that doesn't feel right to me as an open source person. As a Google person, of course, I want the upstream thing to work with my cloud provider. Could we extend that to any cloud provider that's willing to provide conformance tests? Like maybe. I sort of feel like we want to phase that and say, like day 0, we move to a model where we have no cloud providers in it, and here's the criteria for getting your cloud provider added, and then everybody goes back to an equal footing.
Well, we have CAT 13, which has now been approved and pushed, which basically calls for even deployment code to be outside of Kubernetes.
So again, I do see the hands. I want to respond just to one point that Tim made, that as a Googler, he wants his code to be in the upstream distribution. I spend a lot of time on the build and release process and rollout for GKE, and that is explicitly a non-goal so that we can actually apply fixes without waiting for even the rest of our colleagues here at Google to get their own code into open source and cut things. So I want to underscore the benefit of not being in that upstream distribution, and maybe that point is important to what's included in it and what gets pulled in at assembly time. I think I saw Chris nodding. I think this is one of the benefits you have called out as.
It is. I've gotten a lot of mixed feedback from our community about this. There are leaders in our community who are very upset about me wanting to get OpenStack code out of upstream Kubernetes because they feel like we diminish our position if we're not bundled in by default, if we're not part of the default distribution, especially if we're the first to go. That means that we're the first ones who aren't part of the default distribution. But I've also had conversations with, at KubeCon, I was approached by people who said that, it's unfair that you're there and we're not, and we want a level playing field. And I agree with them entirely that, being in, for the reasons you described too about, being able to fix bugs is very difficult when you're being bundled with a large distribution and you have to wait for the next release to be able to fix those things. And so in my mind, to me, the ideal situation is where none of the cloud providers are in tree and being shipped, but that we have a way to either distribute or to discover that's consistent and that is backed by the community so that people know exactly, like, I need the provider for my cloud, and they know exactly where to go for it, and they know that it's trusted because it meets our minimum standard. And so I advocate for a middle ground where we're still shipping things, but we're not shipping things as part of the main kernel.
So it's a middle ground along a different vector, though. It's not a middle ground where some are in and some are out. It's a middle ground of there is minimum viable functionality in what gets spit out in the tarball itself.
Yeah.
And a consistent mechanism for discovery and inclusion of other bits.
And everybody has the opportunity to participate. That's the most important thing to me.
I agree with that completely, and that is exactly what I meant. Putting everybody on equal footing seems like the right thing to do. Though I share your concern and your community concern around being in a diminished position. Google has obviously enjoyed a privileged position with respect to this project and testing and compatibility for a very long time, but it isn't fair. Not that the world is fair, but it's it can be fairer. And so I want to put everybody on equal foot there.
Yeah.
That said, it would be interesting to maybe as a thought experiment to see if maybe the release process could include sort of an index into cloud providers and just spitballing. But in order to prepare a release, we give all cloud providers a 3-day warning, and they have 3 days to produce verifiable test results against a particular snapshot or release candidate. And if they can show those things, then they're included in the release candidate index. And if they're not, then they're not, and they can come along and catch the next one. Something like that.
I mean, I think the way to show that is to have test results being reported back to test grid, because then it's and I think that's one of the goals that we have as part of this group too, is to get people automated and sending results to test grid. And I know that Caleb has been working very hard with a lot of the cloud providers to get buckets for them to send results to, and and I think that's
right.
Been going well.
The distinction I'm making is sort of like, if you can do it in the window that the process gives you, then you're in the default bundle in the sense that you're indexed from it. And if you miss the train, then you miss the train. Think of it like if the Linux kernel model were totally different and all the driver vendors were managed by the vendors, and Linus sent out an email to NVIDIA and said, NVIDIA is a bad example, sent an email to 3Com and said, you have 3 days to produce verified test results of your 3Com drivers, and if so, then they'll be in the tree, and if not, then they won't be. Right?
I think there's an interesting question about what happens with patch releases to the cloud provider code after that moment, but I like the general idea. It does demonstrate some level of commitment and maintenance and interaction.
I wonder whether the index, this notion, has to be in the release in any way, or whether we actually make the index the thing, right? Because I think we have goals that all these separate projects can release more or less on their own schedule. We have goals that we release the core less frequently. We have another goal that we would like for there to be a useful artifact, both for sort of community health reasons, but also sort of for laziness reasons. Like, if we don't give a working combination, then people will try to combine them themselves and find it doesn't work and ask for help, and we spend our lives trying to say this version works with this one and this one doesn't work with this one. It's much easier just to publish that working set. But if we publish that index, maybe that index is the release, the actual release, and maybe the core releases a month early, and there's plenty of time to stabilize. And we can release that index weekly or daily.
That goes to what my talk last year was actually about, right? Like maybe the core and the distribution actually should exist on different cycles, right? I don't want to get into that here because there's really pros and cons to both, but actually, Justin, I sort of like what you said, or at least what I took away from what you said, which is, if the index isn't built into the bundle, but if the index is, say, online, then anybody can come and update the index with their patch release at any point. And by having the verifiable test results, they can say, I've upgraded my cloud provider module, but it still works with 1.16.3. Kubernetes doesn't have to cut 1.16.4 in order to upgrade my cloud provider. People can come in late and say, I'm now certified against 1.16.3. And we could maybe work out the process where you cut RCs and you give the RC, this is a 3-day thing again, the RC has 3 days of soak, and if we cut RC 6 and Google and DigitalOcean and whoever come along and say, I verified against RC 6, RC 6 is approved, therefore it just gets renamed to the final version, the hash is the same, and then my test results carry forward. Although we embed version numbers, so that's broken.
The rock the gold master naming schedule.
I will say, I think that better aligns the incentives with the results that we want, right? So for instance, it gets us to I missed the boat, so I'm not even going to worry about it, versus, hey, it's in everyone's interest to get all the tests working for all releases, right?
There is no boat. I can get on it anytime I want.
Which leaves me in a position of I'm better off getting all the tests working on all, or at least the relevant tests on all the releases, even if it was all.
Yeah. That's a strong point. The incentive to be correct and a week late means it's safe to do that, as opposed to being incorrect but catching the boat. Yeah, you're right.
So I want to call out a time box because we had allocated 20 minutes, but we don't have a heavy agenda for the week, and so I've let it go for about 30 minutes. And I'm wondering if maybe we can maybe spend a few minutes just thinking about what are things that we can work on right now to start acting towards, delivering on what we're talking about. Like, what are the things that we can do to start a new start working towards some goals to how we manage artifacts and produce artifacts, and for the providers as a whole.
So if we had, I think the most useful artifact would be somebody to write down and maybe think through a little bit more of the corners of this idea of the null cloud provider as being the only cloud provider in the release, and that being what conformance is tested against, and to work to it. Does anybody here sit also on SIG release?
Caleb.
Is Caleb here? Oh, there he is.
Yo.
That's the picture. Cool. So it would be interesting to maybe cross-pollinate that idea.
Yes. So I think the first step maybe is just a positional statement that there is something that is executable that comes out of the other end of the Kubernetes release process, that there is a goal for consistency of structure such that tools can discover and include artifacts in a consistent way, and some treatment around the coordinated versioning problem space. And then float that around with SIG release and probably cluster lifecycle and a few other spots just to make sure that it's directionally.
Yeah, definitely also SIG
Fine.
arch.
I think it might be nice if we actually had an explicit, kernel release. I don't know what you want to call it, but image, tar, bits, target.
Do you mean a Linux kernel, or are you using the kernel metaphor?
The kernel metaphor.
Okay.
So if we had some sort of, release target that was meant to be consumable by the cloud providers, so strip it of, clusters, strip it of anything it doesn't need, and just give it something nice and vanilla that is just meant to be consumed by cloud providers?
So I think there's an interesting question of like which way is it outside in, which way is inside out?
Yeah.
Of do we produce a tar file that is lacking any one cloud provider, but has, for example, DNS and all the other core components that we consider to be part of the Kubernetes suite, and say, add your cloud provider, and now you have a fully functioning distribution? Or do we say, here's the kernel, the rest is on somebody else? Cloud providers take that kernel, mix it with their DNS and their cloud provider and their ... and they produce a fully functioning distribution.
So my takeaway from this conversation is that we want the former, that we want to produce something that is executable and complete at the output of the Kubernetes build and release process. I think what Walter was starting to get at is what you didn't want to bring up, which was the kernel distinction and having every 6 weeks release that and never ever cherry pick things. You only fix forward. And if you want that nice new fix, you get the new version. No one will ever spend time fixing the thing before.
That's right. That's a very different conversation. But it's a very different conversation.
Yes, it's a different conversation. But I think we should start with this, at least articulate a position from this group that came through in the consensus of this discussion and see what it looks like, validate it. If it still looks good, then we start to shop it around and see if there are drastic holes in it, or if it's worth bringing up with a SIG architecture and kind of making and staffing a sub-project of SIG release would be my initial spot to start that, but maybe there's a different way to do that.
Aaron's asking, I think, a really interesting question, which is, do we end up at KubeCon again with nothing changed since this talk last year? I think to the topic of the talk, we will very likely end up with nothing has changed, or we have explicitly decided not to change it, which is the thing that I think Walter really wants to talk about. But I think we can end up there with a strong position statement from SIG cloud provider. Well, rewind a year, there was no SIG cloud provider. We supported half as many clouds as we do sort of informally today. And we've made great progress in the extraction of cloud provider, and we can come out with a strong position statement that SIG cloud provider and SIG release both agree that the desired end result is the null cloud provider, and that's what conformance should be testing against. And while it's not maybe a fully ratified plan, that there's large buy-in. I think that'd be decent.
Yeah, I would like to offer an alternative about that's what conformance applies to. I think the goal of the conformance program is actually to demonstrate that in a different distribution or platform that the API surface behaves the way the end user expects.
Sure. I mean,
so there may be a different label or profile that is conformed, but there's base functionality is available in that thing.
You're right. What I mean, I guess what I meant is for the basic tier of conformance is defined by what's available in the null cloud provider.
Okay, maybe there's massaging of the words. I understand the intention.
Got it.
So I'm just wondering, concretely, does this mean, might we have a null cloud provider that's bundled in alongside all of the existing cloud providers that are bundled in? Or do we think we might be at a point where we're ready to talk about no cloud providers being bundled in by Q4? Or, I'm just trying to think, what's the thing you would want to talk about?
So it's a position and a direction, and we haven't had that before. We've had questions. The talk that Tim gave at KubeCon was very forward-looking. My argument would be a lot has changed since then and made it worse, and the problem has begun to actualize rather than being a future risk to discuss. And so ingress and core DNS are concrete examples of where life cycles are independently managed outside, but are critical to the behavior of Kubernetes itself. And we will only see more of that until we all realize how hard it is to get a feature done that cuts across these components. And then there will be an effort for everybody to pull back together into some unified bundling strategy. But these pendulums go back and forth, and we're still definitely in the process of breaking it into more and smaller components.
Understood. So no cloud provider kind of makes sense to me as something we might have it alongside it. And I don't want to blow time, so I'll just say consider the case of the cluster API provider. What would that look like? But we can take that offline. I think we should move on.
So to wrap this discussion up, we've talked about producing a position statement as the first thing that we want to deliver on this. And are there any people who want to volunteer to begin to work on that and maybe present a draft of it at the next meeting in 2 weeks, an initial draft of it?
Yeah, I'll volunteer.
I'll help with that as well.
Okay, so that was Justin and Caleb, or?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I'll put your names down. All right.
Thanks everyone for taking so much time and blowing through the allotted time in that. This is super exciting to me. If you can't tell from this conversation, if you want to follow up offline, find me on Slack. We can keep the conversation going.
And I'm happy to bend anybody's ear about what I think, and everybody knows where to find me.
Yeah. And one thing that I want to remind people of too, with regard to some of these things, we actually added code to the cloud providers in general that allows for them to be marked as deprecated. So we have actually taken concrete steps to start adding machinery to remove the providers. So something to a reminder to everyone. Oh, okay. So the next topic, and I think this next topic actually kind of dovetails nicely with what we've been talking about here because it shares a lot of these issues. So I was at the SIG docs meeting, checking in with them this week, and we had a lot of really positive discussions about kind of the future that the SIG docs team wants to move in, so that they can build a maintainable and reliable set of documentation, and kind of the role that they see us playing in that, as they align with the things that we have kind of stated as our goals and things that we've been working on. So on the whole, SIG docs wants to find a way to make documentation sustainable, especially, and in some ways turn over the maintenance of those documents, from, 1 or 2 people working within the CNCF to the larger SIG communities who are looking at those and maintaining those. And so they've asked us to actually take a few actions, which I think work nicely with things that we are doing. The first is, kind of work that we need to do for ourselves to push our work forward is reviewing the two documents on how to load and run cloud providers, both in tree and out of tree. The out of tree is actually much more complicated, and those stands have been shifting a little bit as Kubernetes has been shifting in how that tooling works. But I feel like one of the things we should really be focusing on delivering sooner rather than later is updated documentation on how you load an entry provider, how you configure it generally, so that we can use that as a basis for the individual providers themselves documenting the the particular parameters and the settings and how their users get those set up. Similarly, this is also very important with the external cloud provider, that we produce a document that works with Kubernetes to how you set up a master, how you load the provider code in there, and how you get it configured. Because there's a little bit more work involved since that code isn't in tree, and it has to be loaded in after the master is started up. So those are 2 things that I think that I would like us to be working towards actually, as soon as possible. And I guess I'm happy to help work on those, but I'm also wondering if there's anybody who wants to volunteer to help produce those documents and send those back to SIG docs for some review, and for this, and for our community, for our SIG also for some review. There are people who have looked at those. So, well, that's something that I can begin to work on, and maybe start pushing some documents up for people to review. But the other thing that SIG docs was asking for too is they've moved. They've changed the technology that they're hosting the docs website on, and now they're looking at. Now that the technology has been updated and the stack that they're serving that from is updated, they're looking at revamping the entire docs website. and they are specifically asking for us to give feedback on the Kubernetes.io docs links for both the setup in general and for picking the right solution. Really what they're looking for is direct feedback on what people think the best way to organize those pages, so that someone new to Kubernetes or someone wanting to stand up Kubernetes on different clusters will be able to show up and be successful in doing that, regardless of the system that they're at. And so this is an ask that SIGDocs has asked of us to look into. So I pasted those links into the chat over here, and if people want to take a look at that and either send feedback to me or send feedback to Zach at the docs team, I think that they would be greatly appreciative of that.
I think that is a great effort. I think some of the challenges here are that, so I have previously maintained a particular opinionated solution, which I think delivers a good outcome, but other people have different opinions, and there are lots of players that want to get their own effort into that page. And so you end up with a page that has like, here are the 50 different options you can use. And so the user comes along and says, I want to run on platform Y, but everyone has a solution for platform Y, and it's not clear which ones are maintained, which ones are easier, and everyone even has different opinions about which ones are easier, right? So it's difficult to know how to curate that and give someone a good experience without favoring like one project over another. That's been the sort of real meta challenge on that.
Right.
In my opinion.
And that's one of the things that they're hoping to get out of us is, this goes back to the previous conversation of how do you discover artifacts and verify them. And they would, they're hoping that if we can come up with a way to say that, this is documentation that's maintained and we've vetted that documentation and we have some process for that, then they are comfortable with presenting that as something that is less geared towards individuals, or be it organizations or individuals themselves, seeking to advance agendas versus, serving a larger community need. And that's what they're hoping to get out of this. And hopefully use it as a model for how other SIGs document their work too. Yeah, are there any other questions or things that people have input on with this?
No, it's a tricky question, especially what Justin raises, and that avoiding the jockeying for position or ordering or defaulting and these kinds of situations. Elsewhere in the code, we use a lot of foo and bar, and so maybe those examples or random round robining of populating from a list as the example are strategies that we've used in the past that might be helpful. So curious what other people come up with as suggestions, but it is tough.
I do applaud the effort. Like what tends to happen is we curate it, come up with a pretty short list, and it gradually degrades over time, and then someone gets the momentum up to do it again. So if we can do that, then we will have a year of greater happiness.
Yeah, I've seen this come up before within the context of just the ecosystem as a whole, but nobody has yet stepped up to provide the sort of solution where I think the community wins if the community is empowered to help curate. So this option right now where a select group of people get to choose what shows up, yeah, you get this sawtooth pattern of it builds up and then it drops. Allowing people to sort of transparently do this without having to update a website would be the ideal solution, but we're not there. I just think that page right now is completely paralyzing to a new user.
Yeah.
Just choose one of these 1,000 things. It's so easy.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I feel like one of the first set of artifacts that we produce are generic documents that should work for everybody and that we agree works for everybody, and then use that as a foundation for, then when you want to extend, you start with the general and you go to the extension, and it becomes, because then it becomes tractable for everybody to maintain what they're working on. The general stuff can be maintained. you have a large community of people who are invested in that, and then you focus on the more specific things, and the providers themselves, can focus on those specific things. And if we establish standards of just like, there's a parameter in your code, you should document it, and we verify that, then setting objective standards for what it means to be included in those documentations, I think is, part of what we're trying to do here. And it helps prevent some of that gaming and that, like, let's try to stuff everything into there.
Cool.
I know one option that we haven't, well, I think actually, Tim actually, I don't know if you've tried this, right? Where I think there's package usage reporting, and like we can try to get information on what is actually used out there. It's obviously very sensitive information in some regards, and also users don't necessarily want to report like all the versions that they're running to some weird private service, but we could give it another go. Tim, what was the name of that thing?
Spartacus?
Spartacus.
That's it, with a K.
That's right. It's still running. People can run it now if they want to. I haven't read the data in a while, but it's still there.
Maybe if we move that to the CNCF or something, people might be more willing. I don't know.
Maybe. It's a framework, as a proof of concept for something that we could do. It's not a production-ready thing, I guess. And we don't have clear questions that we want answered by the data, so the data is necessarily insufficient for any questions. We have to define the questions first. Right?
No, you just get everything and then decide later what you wanted to know.
Jago, you are a representative of Google here.
Okay, with 8 minutes left, I want to make sure that we give Walter time to discuss this topic too for the Cloud Controller Manager and anything that comes out of that.
Well, I mean, actually, thank you, Andrew, Nick, and Caleb for actually reviewing it. We actually pushed it, so we're, it is now officially one of our caps. I strongly recommend people read it. We're not closing it. We're not saying we're not going to take feedback or anything, but I mean, there's quite a few proposals in there about how to build a cloud provider, how to set up the repo, and how we should move forward to the point where we can remove all cloud provider specifics from Kubernetes, whether they're deployment or, cloud provider specific, libraries. So yeah, please make sure you're looking at that. If there are any problems, the sooner we know about it, the better. But I mean, at this point, it's an official cap.
Yeah, so one question I had about it was, okay, so it's clear that we want the cloud provider code out, but the cap, right, as of right now, has all the controllers in it, all the cloud provider specific controllers, so that's service controller, route controller, whatever. And so I'm not sure if we want to be pushing the controller code out to staging as of right now. It seems like that's a bit unclear. And that's just kind of based on a gut feeling. Like, I just don't know if the controller code that consumes a cloud provider necessarily needs to be like pushed out to a different repo or anything.
Yeah, I mean, so my only worry is that if I would like us to get to the point where the Kubernetes core doesn't even depend on cloud provider. I would like us to be completely agnostic. I mean, and yeah, let's have the discussion. I think it's a great discussion to have. But the perspective I'm coming from is, if we can get to the point where nothing in Kubernetes depends on a cloud provider, then we know we're done. And so there are 3 controllers in Tree right now that depend on cloud provider specific code. So that's where I'm coming from. That's why I was hoping to move those controllers specifically out.
Can I throw one word in there? There is a plan, maybe you've reviewed it, I don't know if you have, on the storage team to use the CSI drivers to thunk and get the built-in cloud provider-based storage drivers out. Okay, cool.
Yep.
Nice.
So
yeah, so I guess the distinction that I want to make is like, does having code that depends on an interface that is completely not directly tied to cloud provider code, does that count as a cloud provider dependency?
So I mean, one of the things we've certainly discussed, I think is a great question, is if I look at Node IPAM controller, I think, in fact, the way we were viewing this, and this is mostly because I think we, Google, are the only ones who actually make use of the cloud provider interface in Node IPAM controller, was to have two versions of it. One that is in tree, where we've actually deleted all the cloud provider dependencies, and then a separate version of the Node IPAM controller, which is the one that is pulled in and used by Google's Cloud Controller Manager. And so maybe we want to look at doing something like that. But I think that, you know, and if we did that, then I don't have any problems with things like service and route controller remaining in tree. But I really would like to get to the point where we can't accidentally have built any cloud provider dependency into what we've been sort of referring to as the kernel modules, right? So I would love to get to the point where the Kube API server, the KCM, and Kubelet do not take a cloud provider option and cannot load the cloud provider library and are completely agnostic and work in a very understandable, predictable way. And if you need something like specific Node IPAM behavior, then you disable the Node IPAM controller in the KCM and you run it in the CCM.
Okay, so maybe this is looking a little bit too far into the future, but where would those controllers, like once they're out of staging, where would they live eventually? Because like I don't see us having, I mean, like I guess it could live in Cloud Controller Manager repo, but it seems like from the KEP, it seems like we're saying like, oh, we're gonna have a controllers repo that has like service route controller or whatever.
So one, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So one possibility is we could, if we, we could do that. The other is if we said, look, there is a Google Controller Manager and a AWS Controller Manager and a, you know, a DigitalOcean Controller Manager repo, maybe they can have their controllers, their version of the controller living there specifically. And right now, it seems like we're basically heading towards those being CNCF repos. So that's still open source code. So, you know, anyone who cares can still see what those controllers are doing when they're running for their cluster. But it's not polluting the large, polluting is the wrong word, but it's not obfuscating the general behavior of a different cloud provider.
Okay. Okay, cool. Yeah, let me think about that more.
Oh, it sounds like a good thing for us to discuss again, but given it's just you and I talking, Andrew, and I'm sure Justin and a few others are starting to have bells going off, maybe we should make sure we have this discussion again in 2 weeks when people have had a chance to think about it.
Yeah, sounds good.
I'll put it on the agenda. Good idea.
Thanks so much for your time, everybody. I got to bounce.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Have a great week.